Hello, and thank you for tuning in again for this week's episode of the Three Questions podcast. This is Paul Saunders with the Center for the National Interest. We had China last time. Now we're going to pivot to Europe this time. And I'm really pleased to have with me Joshua Huminski, who is Senior Vice President for National Security and Intelligence at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, a terrific fellow think tank here in Washington, D.C. And Joshua has kind of a very impressive background of researching and writing on European defense issues, and is currently actually working on a book on that topic. So I'm very interested and looking forward to kind of delving in on some of these European defense questions. And thanks very much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul. I'm really excited to participate in the conversation.
So to dive right in here on European defense, over the course of the last few weeks, we've seen more and more reports from European intelligence agencies just within the last day or two. And, we're talking on August 13th. So a little bit before the episode will go online, but we've seen many, many reports about Russia maybe about to escalate in its war in Ukraine. Russia may be about to launch new or different kinds of attacks on European countries. People use this term hybrid warfare, which I'm not a big fan of the term because I find it a little bit murky in terms of what it actually means. But these are steps kind of short of full-scale war. There are certainly others, who are worried that there might be, a larger full-scale war. We had just in the last several days, this incident at the airport in Leipzig, where there was a small drone with explosives strapped to it in the vicinity of a Ukrainian cargo aircraft. So, just looking at all of that, Joshua, how well prepared are our European allies to manage a potential Russian escalation? And here I'm talking about it, escalation targeting some of our allied countries. And there's a spectrum, of course, from some of the more of the kinds of sabotage or drones or missiles or aircraft kind of crossing borders, some incidents at sea. We've seen a number of things like that already. There's a spectrum between that and, Russia deciding to invade another country or to launch kind of a deliberate, serious missile strike on a target in one of those countries. Are our European allies ready for that? Are they more ready for some things than for others? How would you assess their defense capabilities at this point, 4.5 years into this terrible war in Ukraine?
There's a very good question. There's a lot in there. And I think actually what I'll do is, if I can, I'm going to parse it into the intelligence component and the actual response component. Because you're absolutely right. We've been seeing a lot of increasingly concerning reports from various intelligence communities, national intelligence agencies saying that there is a possibility that Russia will undertake some action at some point, possibly as soon as this autumn, but through to 2029, 2030. The problem with a lot of these intelligence pictures is that they're sufficiently vague as to cover the fact that Russia will do something at some point in the future. That's not massively helpful. The interesting thing I'll also note is that there's almost an inversion of where we are today versus where we were 4 years ago in terms of the concerning rhetoric coming out of, say, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania versus Western intelligence agencies. What you're seeing now is a frontline state saying they don't anticipate certainly a conventional attack within the next year or two because of the forced degradation that Russia is experiencing in Ukraine. But you're seeing countries such as Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States as well issuing more concerning reports about the likelihood of a potential conflict. And so there's a lot that goes into these intelligence reports, and part of it, and my reading of it, is there is a need, particularly in European states such as Germany and France, to raise the prospect of a conventional conflict to justify increased defense expenditures. If there's no sense of threat, the likelihood that the public is going to support it is reduced. Now, of course, that's not to say that everything's politicized here, but it's just a factor to keep in mind. When I look at the Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, and even the Finnish intelligence reports, they're concerned, but they're confident into where they are and the weaknesses of the Russian forces. So there's a lot that goes into those intelligence reports. And I just would kind of keep it in perspective as we rewind that clock again. 4 years ago, the Eastern flank states were raising a lot of concern, but other countries were downplaying it. Fast forward to today, those same frontline states are looking at the Russian force structure and Russian intentions and saying, we're not as concerned as we are today, but the threat perspective has moved west, if you will.
Just going to interject there. I mean, as I recall, 4.5 years ago, actually, the Ukrainian leadership was in some respects, the one that seemed the most relaxed. And there may well have been a domestic political element to that too, because it's very dangerous. Any government that believes it may be facing an imminent invasion has kind of a responsibility to weigh how it prepares for that against the dangers of creating panic or something like that. But
Absolutely.
Your point is very well taken.
And I also think we need to look at it certainly from the Russian perspective as to where they are today. And that's coming to that second component that you're asking about European preparedness, but I also look about Russian capabilities at this moment. The Russian conventional ground forces are significantly degraded by Ukraine's performance. There are a lot of political reasons why the Russians are not performing as well as they are, and we can certainly get into that. But the losses that Russia is experiencing are significant in terms of both men and material, as well as munitions. Now, we need to caveat that by saying Russia is still looking to restructure its military to 1.5 million personnel in terms of conscripts, not contract soldiers. They're producing modern battle tanks, T-80s, as I believe, and putting some of those into stocks. So they are regenerating some capacity. They're expanding the production of drones and loiter munitions. So while they are degraded on the battlefield in Ukraine, they are still retaining the capacity to sustain that fight while refilling some of their stocks to a certain degree. So Russian capabilities are certainly not what they were, say, 4 years ago. I mean, those losses are significant. And Ukraine's battlefield performance has increased as well. Now, if we look at the Europeans do face some systemic and structural challenges. They've had a bit of a holiday from history when it comes to defense up until February 2022. The thought that conventional war returning to the European continent was almost unthinkable. They didn't think that necessarily that was a possibility. Economic interlinkages, energy interdependencies, the Fukuyama's end of history, sort of whatever you want to call it, there was not necessarily the level of preparation for the risk of high intensity conflict and conventional war that there once was. This was a period of the global war on terrorism, when militaries were going to expeditionary forces, smaller forces. They weren't necessarily prepared for the risk of a conventional conflict from Russia. And now Ukraine has ended all of those illusions. And what you're seeing is a bit of a lagging indicator from February 2022 to where we are today, where there was a recognition that things needed to change. There was an expectation that the situation might have gone in a different direction, and there wouldn't necessarily be the requirement for European militaries to stand up on their own, which is the NATO 3.0 and America's rebalancing of the Pacific that predated President Trump, but certainly accelerated in January 2024. So there's a lot of these dynamics happening, and I think we can only really judge or assess European military capabilities vice what they're going up against. The Estonians, the Latvians, Lithuanians are very, very well prepared. The Finns, the Swedes are very well prepared. The major militaries of Germany and France are a bit of a lagging indicator. Germany finally just came out with their Responsibility for Europe plan, which has long-term plans through 2039. Poland has long-term plans through 2039. So they're not where they want to be today, but they're looking to get there. France faces challenges where they have a multi-domain operational force, so their investments are spread across everything from conventional to nuclear deterrence, but also concerned about Southern Europe. So there's a lot of dynamics that are happening at this time, of course, with the United States looking to rebalance the Pacific and draw down its conventional support for NATO and in Europe. And so I think the Europeans in many ways are better off than I actually think they are, especially vis-a-vis the Russians. And what's funny is if you read the national security strategy and the national defense strategy of President Trump, the language that's in there has almost greater confidence in European capacity vis-a-vis Russia than the Europeans seem to have. So I think we're at an okay position today, but the trajectory, which is more significant for me, is going to be increasing, even if those maximalist objectives of 460,000 German troops, 500,000 Polish soldiers, for example, even if they're not met, I'm confident in the trajectory that they're heading.
You mentioned Poland a couple of times in there. It's been a little while since I looked at the data, but I was doing some work on Poland a few months ago, and I was really pretty impressed. I mean, the amount of money that they're spending on procurement, the kinds of things that they're buying, and also their plans just to increase the size of the force. It kind of looked to me like they were on a trajectory to be probably the third or fourth largest NATO military force, fairly
Mhm.
soon.
Poland individually accounts for 48% of South Korea's defense exports. They're buying everything the South Koreans will make in terms of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armor personnel carriers. It is incredible what the Poles are doing. And I think what you're seeing is the center of gravity in NATO, in particular in European defense policy, is starting to shift a bit eastward. If we were looking at NATO, 1.0 or 2.0 being sort of Anglo-American, Anglo-German or German-French. Now you're seeing very much German and Polish, and then the frontline states with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. That center of gravity has shifted eastward.
Yeah, no, it's really pretty impressive. I'm sort of assuming that at least some of those South Korean systems are not staying in Poland. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have this idea that some of them may be crossing the border. Just to be clear to our listeners, I mean crossing the border as assistance to Ukraine, not with Polish officers driving them somewhere. Shifting gears here a little bit, you brought up the United States. I brought up the United States. In terms of these intelligence assessments, you mentioned kind of changing U.S. expectations and priorities. As the United States kind of thinks about its own defense requirements and needs. I'm wondering, as the Europeans work to rebuild their capability, how do you see the key gaps that they have where, having the United States beside them, behind them, with them, whatever preposition one wants to use, what is it that they really need from America to our NATO allies to be an effective force if they are really tested by Russia?
Well, I think short of that, we need to take a look at what the United States really provides towards those European allies and partners in the European pillar within NATO. The United States, in many ways, is the glue that holds together this alliance. It provides the command and control structure. It provides the leadership. It provides the sort of exercising component aspect. So it provides that the almost intangible aspects of sort of staff operations, if you will, that no single member of NATO can provide by itself. This is an overarching structure of the command and control, the leadership, the officer cadres, and whatnot that stitches everything together. And that's really hard to quantify or sort of explain in a way that's you can say, oh, 10 tanks equal this. So that glue is really, really important. But what you're
And
seeing
that's
now
not
is
something that the NATO Secretariat in Brussels, for example, would be able to handle.
no, I don't think so. But what I think you're seeing though is even below the sort of United States command aspect is a lot of these NATO operations are occurring in many places without direct United States involvement. So you're seeing Romania and France conducting activities. You're seeing the Italians working with the Baltic states. You're seeing a lot of this structure existing and operating without direct United States presence or involvement. And so the structure of NATO is acting in many ways that it's supposed to, is by design. So these interlinkages and interconnections between member states are fantastic and help advance that sort of defense and deterrence posture. So there's that component for it. There's also the value that just the sheer American presence of American forces, American men and women in uniform and tanks and artillery provide for a lot of these frontline states. I was in Lithuania last year, and one of the key phrases was that having American presence there was not necessarily materially going to alter the balance, order of battle or the balance of force between, say, Russia and NATO, but it was confidence inspiring. It was that the United States had a stake in the conflict. It wasn't just sort of providing over the horizon capabilities or command and control or intelligence information. It was that American men and women in uniform were there side by side with the Lithuanians. Lithuanians were also having a German brigade permanently present there, which is an amazing turn of events in history for that. So the presence matters. And so when the United States is sending signals about whether or not this brigade or this division or this unit is going to be in or rotating out, or the delays to deployments are going to happen, it sends a signal that impacts confidence for a lot of these countries. They are very confident in their own capabilities. I mean, without question, the Estonians, I hosted the Estonian defense attaché a couple of weeks ago for a roundtable, and he said unequivocally, if the Russians come over the border, the Estonians are going to shoot them. They're not going to wait for NATO to respond. They're going to fight. But having an American presence there, an American stake in the conflict, provides that confidence to know that they're backed up. They're not going to be alone in this.
You're kind of reminding me of the American forces in West Berlin during the Cold War, being at that time, we used this term, a tripwire. We couldn't have really a large presence in West Berlin militarily. It was like an island, inside East Germany, in a manner not dissimilar from the Baltic states being sort of geographically isolated from the rest of Europe. So sorry to interject there, Joshua, but
no, you're absolutely right.
That's what you have in mind, a tripwire.
Well, it's not just a tripwire, but it's that presence that they're fighting side by side. They're working together as the NATO alliance, and then militarily and technologically. I mean, obviously, the United States' extended nuclear umbrella is a huge aspect of NATO nuclear deterrence and deterrent policy. The provision of various weapons systems, which we're finding challenges in terms of the delivery, which even predated Iran. I mean, Patriot missile batteries were delayed out to 2029 to begin with, and because of the Ukraine conflict. And now you're seeing a challenge of, okay, the United States has made commitments to sell various pieces of equipment such as PAC-3s and HIMARS systems, and the delivery timelines keep slipping further and further out to 2029, 2030, 2035. And so there's this aspect of the actual physical component of delivery of weapon systems. But then there's also, again, in terms of air-to-air refueling, heavy lift capacity, airborne early warning, command and control, intelligence, surveillance, targeting, and reconnaissance capabilities. These are these things that the United States provides to NATO, that NATO, the European pillar of the NATO, doesn't have the capacity yet to deliver and deploy independently of the United States, but they are slowly working towards that aspect. You're seeing, Saab selling, I think they're called Swordfish maritime patrol aircraft, for example. You're seeing the European Union, but also United Kingdom and Germany investing very heavily in space-based capabilities. So this is a time of transition where even as the United States takes a step back from forward leadership and forward presence under NATO 3.0, they still intend to provide those enabling capabilities. But you're seeing Europe respond in kind and saying that we may not necessarily be able to rely wholly on the United States, but even if we can, maybe we want to have sovereign capabilities that we can cover off. Because I think Iran is a great example of that crisis scenario that Europe feared. If the United States found itself engaged in a Middle East or indeed Pacific conflict, what would they be able to do in Europe? And now you're seeing the repositioning of refueling assets, air defense interceptors, naval assets to the Middle East because of the Iran epic fury. Now Europe says, oh, this scenario that we were worried about just became real.
Very interesting and a lot to think about there. My last set of questions here, I guess, center around deterrence. And how can, we, the United States and our allies, collectively deter Russia from pursuing any of these kinds of things that we might be worried about? And, you made the point, obviously, that, well, you made a few points. I mean, one is that there are different views on the extent to which we should be worried. You also observed that Russia is kind of not 10 feet tall. It wasn't 10 feet tall when it started the war, and it might be a foot or two shorter than it was, when it started the war. Although, they're certainly also kind of learning and developing new tactics and capabilities and technologies, too, which to be very worried about. But I guess I've always been really intrigued by deterrence because when we in the sort of foreign policy and national security profession talk about deterrence, especially when we talk publicly about deterrence, it's almost always about kind of one of two things. We need to have more tanks, planes, missiles, shells, whatever. If we build a sufficiently high enough pile of weapons upon which we can sit, then that will be a deterrent, and we don't really need to worry about anything else. And the other thing that people always kind of talk about is, well, we really need to do X, Y, or Z in this unrelated place because these other people are watching what we're doing there. And if we don't do this there, then they'll think they can do that here. But I guess I kind of always have felt that most deterrence actually doesn't really have to do with how much stuff we have. I mean, that's part of it. It's not that it isn't part of it. It is part of it. And I also tend to be kind of skeptical of these arguments that it's transferable, from kind of one situation to another. And I just feel like most deterrence actually is inside our heads and our adversaries' heads, in the sense that how do they think we will react to their taking these various steps, and kind of what will it cost them? We have ways to influence how they think, but we ultimately don't control how they think, in part actually, because people make mistakes, but there are other reasons too. But I guess I'm just kind of wondering how you look at the question of deterrence. I mean, is it enough just to build up these capabilities and to make a bunch of strong statements, and we need to like defeat Iran, and then defeating Iran will mean that Russia won't dare to kind of do this or that? What's the answer to all of that?
Well, the challenge is that I think, unfortunately, deterrence has become to mean everything for everyone, everywhere, all at once. So the idea is, you can deter everything, for example, and the problem is you can't. Unfortunately, you can't deter certain behaviors. You can deter a specific actor from doing specific behaviors over a specific time period. The nuclear deterrence is a great example. The nuclear deterrent exists to basically deter its own use. But can you deter a cyber actor, for example? Can you hold them with deterrence by punishment? Can you attribute it, and then can you punish them accordingly to prevent them from doing it again in the future? Arguably not. And that's where the idea of deterrence by resilience comes in. Have resilient and redundant systems to ensure that a adversary's action does not have a deleterious effect on what you are doing. Can you deter by denial, which is very much the point you were asking about, or raising, excuse me, about having a stockpile of sufficient kit and munitions and personnel that deters the adversary for coming across the border, in this case Russia. So I think the challenge is that what deterrent has become to mean today is becoming the everything button, the easy button. We just press deter and the adversary is deterred. Well, that doesn't really quite work that way, unfortunately. And I think, especially in Washington parlance, that's just what the phrase has become. It's that Staples equivalent of the easy button. And so I think we need to right size what we are able to deter, what we are capable of deterring, either through denial, through punishment if necessary, but also through resilience. And I think if you look at Finland and Sweden, for example, in the frontline states, they have the idea of total defense or societal resilience, which is great and critical for deterring. As you said, I'm not a fan of hybrid war either. Gray zone activity, sub-threshold activity, wherever they are. But having a resilient society that is immune or inoculated against propaganda, for example, is going to undermine the efficacy of that capability. But you do need to have national defenses to deter an adversary from launching conventional strikes. And I think that's where you're seeing develop. So I think the deterrent posture also has to involve communication. which is a critical thing that we are not doing well right now. We don't have any real substantive engagement with Russia right now to manage escalation, to signal strategically, if you do X, we will do Y. I think of the Biden administration, there was the issue of the use by Russian intelligence of cargo and logistics flights to try incendiary devices. And I think under President Biden, the director of Central Intelligence talked to his counterpart in the SVR and said, this is a red line. If there are casualties because of this, there will be consequences. And then that activity stops. So communicating what we will do in response to certain thresholds is absolutely vital. So there's a lot that we can do in terms of denial, resiliency, and punishment. But we also have to communicate and attempt to understand, more importantly, from the adversary's perspective, in this case, Russia's perspective, what deters them? What do they hold at risk? As we're seeing right now, just by what the Ukrainians are doing and conducting a long range and deep precision strike, striking wildberries, for example, which is the Russian equivalent of Amazon, isn't really deterring Russian activity. It's just punishing in response. The question becomes, after the conflict, how can Ukraine and its European partners in NATO deter Russia from launching another attack, another February 2022? And that's a bigger question. So, what does the Ukrainian force structure look like? What do European backers of Ukraine offer in terms of sanctions, munitions, support, material presence of forces in a non NATO but sovereign capacity? And can you build up Ukraine to be sufficiently strong in a sovereign capacity that it can deter on its own? And so I think that as a first principle, we need to really correct our understanding of deterrence. It is not that metaphorical easy button and requires a lot of key constituent components to include, as you rightly note, having sufficient stockpiles and defense industrial depth, being able to surge capacity and production for PAC-3s, Javelins, air defense interceptors of every shape and size and form is a deterrent in of its own. Because if your adversary knows that if they do something, your stocks might drop down, but then Lockheed, Raytheon et al. Are going to increase their production markedly, is a great way to demonstrate deterrence by resilience. So there's a lot that goes into it. I'm just very wary of thinking that you can deter everything everywhere all at once.
I'm glad you made that point because I certainly very much share that view. And, you mentioned nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, I think, are kind of a very good example of what the problem is with deterrence, in the sense that, as you said, you can use nuclear weapons to deter someone from attacking you with nuclear weapons. Once you start moving beyond that, it gets kind of increasingly difficult, I think, actually, to justify a nuclear response, certainly we see in like Russian doctrine, and, there are signs that there may be some evolution in US doctrine, we can use nuclear weapons in the Russian case, if like the survival of the country is at stake, or, there are kind of attacks on our decision-making centers, they mean like their kind of key strategic sites. Those are situations where I guess it's sort of plausible, that somebody would use nuclear weapons. But you're obviously not going to use nuclear weapons because a drone went across your air border, or for that matter, something kind of more serious than that kind of falls short of existential conflict. And I guess I tend to think the same thing really applies to conventional deterrence, in the sense that, you can't like launch a major war because somebody engaged in one of these so-called gray zone activities. That's the whole point of the gray zone activities.
Right.
In the first place.
At the end of the day, deterrence really comes down to capability, credibility, and communication. You have to have a capability or a tool to respond to or prevent an activity from taking place, but it all has to be credible. You raise a great point. You're not going to launch a nuclear strike because you had an airspace violation or a drone or a missile landed in your territory. that in saying so is fundamentally not credible. And everybody knows that it's not credible. To your point with the Russian strategic doctrine, in the event that the survival of the state is at question or is at risk, the likelihood of nuclear weapons being used is very credible. But this also comes down to communication.
And by the way, I mean, in the Russian case, the survival of the state probably for Vladimir Putin means, me staying in power. I mean,
Right.
those are kind of like the same two things. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. And I think you raised that great point. That comes down to the communications component. And I think this is where, for as much as NATO has been criticized for not responding more forcefully to these airspace violations, to be it drone or be it the missile landing in Poland, for example, or the drones near Romanian facilities, it's because the communications is taking place. There's a capability that it is responding in a commensurate manner, and it's fundamentally credible. It's saying, okay, this has happened. We have protocols in place to manage escalation, and it is fundamentally credible. The Russians know where these thresholds are and keeping it just below. Now, the question is when something goes above that threshold, if the Russians decide to move the border to just a little bit to the west, then what happens? And so I think this is where this is an evolving process, and this where the communications component comes in very, very clearly, signaling to Moscow that these are our red lines that may provoke a response. Not saying what that response is, because you don't want prepackaged capabilities and saying that the politicians' hands are tied, but saying once you breach this, there will be material consequences, and that has to be fundamentally credible and understood from Moscow's perspective. Equally, we need to understand, to your point, the way that Russia looks at deterrence and the way that Russia looks at its own strategic survival, and understanding that what we're attempting to signal may not necessarily be what Russia's receiving.
Absolutely. All very excellent points. So, Joshua, thank you very much for joining me today. Again, for our listeners, this is Joshua Huminski, Senior Vice President for National Security and Intelligence at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress here in Washington, D.C. And I, of course, am Paul Saunders with the 3 Questions podcast. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.